My favorite dish is salmon, hands down. Nicely grilled salmon with a little bit of simple sauce on it, and some broccoli on the side, maybe a little bit of rice, a nice glass of wine. It took me probably 20 years as a business journalist to see that ownership is really at the root of corporate behavior and at the root of our economy. So, there's a story that I think illustrates that. It's in New Orleans, actually. There was a wonderful company there. It's called Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. We have some of those in Boston. It grew into this enormous chain. They're all over the country. And at one time, it was run by Ruth. And Ruth, there was a time in New Orleans, they had a storm, they had a blackout. Ruth's steaks were in the refrigerator thawing out, and she said, what the heck? She went out in the streets, she started grilling steaks, giving them away to the rescue workers for free. And this was how Ruth ran her company. Well, that company was sold. It went public, and that means that its ownership shares were traded on Wall Street, a publicly traded company. That happened in the very same year that Hurricane Katrina hit. So the company goes public. A couple of months later, Hurricane Katrina hits. What does the CEO of Ruth's Chris Steakhouse do now? Well, he's not out in the streets grilling steaks. He decides to close up shop and leave town. And the reason is that the ownership design of that company changed. It was no longer a locally held company. It was a company that was held on Wall Street. And it no longer had a purpose of feeding people, being rooted in its community. It had a purpose of maximizing its share price. So this guy up and left. It was a huge controversy in town, and Ruth's family was furious. It illustrates what happens when the ownership design of a company changes. And it illustrates something deeper than that, which is that, systems thinking, the scientific thinking behind all living systems basically tells us that system structure is the source of system behavior. Now, it's very fashionable today. I don't know if fashionable is the word. It might be more, say, common or habitual to complain about CEOs. We think CEOs are the bad guys. Or people will point to Walmart as a bad guy or Exxon as a bad guy. And certainly there's a lot of bad guys out there. But underneath all of these different companies, there is a common structure. It's this ownership shares trading on Wall Street. There's a purpose inherent in that structure, which is to maximize profits, which maximizes share price, and everything else is considered basically not relevant. Now, okay, so I've been a student of ownership design for 25 years now, and it can be the most boring topic in the world. It seems irrelevant. It seems, what does it have to do with anything? Why does anyone care about such a thing? What I perceive, and I would not even say that I argue this, I would say that I perceive this as a business journalist, financial journalist for a quarter century, and now a consultant and author of several books, and working out in the field to start alternative kind of companies. I have really seen over and over again over the years that is ownership design that drives companies. Another interesting example is Goldman Sachs, actually. All of the big Wall Street banks now, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, of course, Lehman Brothers went down. That's what triggered the 2008 financial crisis. There's a whole series of these investment banks that were at one time were all partnerships. Now that means that the people who worked there, a few at the top, held the ownership shares. And I had a conversation. My brother used to be a partner at a smaller one of these kind of firms, and he said, look, here's how it works. When you're a partner in a firm, an investment banking firm, and you're trading, you're gambling with your own money. You know, you're trading, but it's your own money. And so there are limits to how much risk that you'll take. But when those companies go public, and all of them went public in the late 1990s, Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, all became publicly traded companies. And my brother said, he said, then someone else is taking all the risk and you're making all the money. That's going to change your behavior dramatically. And of course, right? And it did. Those companies stopped observing the traditional bounds of risk. They stopped caring if they were financing bad mortgage loans, because they're like, we don't care if they go bad. We're going to get our commissions. We're going to get our money. We're going to sell these things. Someone else is going to hold them. And so once again, a shift in ownership design drove behavior that in turn drove the entire world economy off a cliff. And another example, you look today at ExxonMobil. I mean, why are we not dealing with climate change? Bill McKibben calls this the $20 trillion challenge. I mean, there's $20 trillion in so-called assets sitting on the balance sheet. That means your balance sheet is what you hold, that you own your assets. You know, if you own a house, that's one of your assets. Well, these oil companies came to claim to hold all of these petroleum reserves as their assets, and so they lose $20 trillion, their shareholders, or we lose the earth. That's the that's the challenge we're up against. Again and again and again, in so many different contexts, whether it's oil, whether it's housing, whether it's banking, you see there's this similar ownership design at the root. It's one of the things that systems thinking tells us is that all social systems are value centric. That means that they're organized. We self-organize ourselves around what we care about. Democracy is a social system. You know, we're organized around equality and justice. The courts are a social system. They're organized around justice. So there's something that we care about. We organize around it. Well, Wall Street firms, capital-centric firms, are organized around capital. They're organized around the notion that financial wealth is the highest good and more is always better when it comes to financial wealth. And so let's organize our economy around this principle. And we organize our economy basically at the level of the firm. And so you have firms organized around maximizing capital. That's how they, in my first book, The Divine Right of Capital, I explored what is that structure? How do you organize a firm around this? And it starts with the financial statements. How do you define success? Companies define success by their financial statements. You have revenue coming in, you have costs going out, what's left over is profit. Well, that's a particular way of adding and subtracting. It's just kind of a made up thing. But that locks us into a certain way of looking at the world, and profit becomes the purpose of that firm. Okay, so then I wrote my second book to say, well, what the heck do you do about this? It's one thing to see a problem, but how do you begin to address it? Now, I for many years was a co-founder, publisher, and president of Business Ethics Magazine, and this is where I really learned to see that ownership design is at the root of company behavior. So I did that for 20 years. I published The Divine Right of Capital, and I moved to TELUS Institute in Boston. And with Alan White, a colleague, we organized a project called Corporation 2020. We said, okay, Alan had seen the same thing I had seen, the design of companies, ownership design is really the root. It's really the root issue of our economy and of our global crisis. The root issue. But it's so complex. People feel like they can't understand it, they can't see it. And so it's kind of my life mission to help people not only see this and understand it, but to understand that there are other ways of organizing an economy. Not communism, not some fantasy utopianism, but right now, in the real world, all over the world, there are other kinds of enterprises that are owned differently. And it's not only about companies. It's about any kind of ownership. So we did Corporation 2020. We said, how do you design companies differently? I tried to go out and talk about this to people and found it was intensely boring. And so I embarked on a journey around the U.S. and around the globe when I could manage to get myself to different countries, and said, well, how would you design companies different? Are there other companies or other kinds of things that are owned out there now that are different? And I found that there are so many examples of many kinds all over the world. Now, one of the things is that the ownership design we have right now is a monoculture. This is how the industrial age likes to do things. We find one thing, we like to do agriculture a certain way, so we do industrial agriculture. We grow corn everywhere, from as far as the eye can see. We have one form of company, and we organize all our companies that way. But in the emerging economy, it's called the new economy. I call it the generative economy, which means that it's life-serving. We live now in a capitalist economy. It's all organized around financial capital, but we can organize an economy around life, keeping ourselves and the planet alive. I mean, how else are we going to organize our economy? If we'd like to be here another 1,000 or 2,000, God willing, 10,000, 20,000 years, it's not going to be an economy organized around Wall Street. It's not. We know that. It has to be something else. We have to reorganize ourselves around life, community life, family life, employees. We need to be focused on employee well-being. We need to focus on ecological well-being. So how do you organize companies now in the real world to do that? Well, this is what I do in my second book, Owning Our Future, The Emerging Ownership Revolution. I travel around and I look at this. So let me tell you just a couple of those stories. While you're enjoying your dinner, I'll be enjoying my tea here. Okay, so here's one of my really all-time favorites. This is a fabulous company. I went to London and I visited the John Lewis Partnership. This is, have you ever heard of this? No one's ever heard of this, of course, because you can't buy stock in it. We only read in the financial press about what you can buy stock in. That's one of the reasons we don't know about these other companies. Okay, so the John Lewis Partnership, it is the largest department store chain in the United Kingdom. It has multiple $1 billion in sales, and that's billion with a B. And it's if it was on the Fortune 500, it would be like the top third. It's a big company, bigger than Monsanto. It's 100% owned by its employees. And now here's the really interesting part. The purpose of this company, you can go on their website and see this for yourself. The purpose of this company is to serve employee happiness. Serve employee happiness. I'll say that a second time. Who has ever heard of a $4 billion company organized around employee happiness? But it is, actually. And okay, so how do you know if that's true? How do you know that's just not more corporate BS, which of course there's a lot of that out there? Every year, this company shares roughly half of its profits in direct checks written out to employees, profit sharing. Last year, this company made about $600 million in profits. It wrote checks, we're talking cash checks, $300 million, $360 million actually, out to employees as bonuses. Somebody working on the floor of a department store, they also have several hundred grocery stores. A clerk at a grocery store is getting a bonus check equal to 17% of their pay. This was, maybe $4,000 last year, something like that. That's real money for somebody who's sitting and punching a cash register all day long. 17% of their pay in a direct bonus check. They also have pensions, so they don't have to save for retirement because they're going to have this pension. So that gives you an idea of how much money could be freed up if we were not sending it all to a financial elite that holds most of the shares through Wall Street. This company, you remember I said system structure is the source of system behavior, okay? So now system structure, what do I mean by that? Well, in ownership, I mean 5 things. I mean purpose, I mean membership, who owns the shares of that company? In this case, it's the employees. Governance, so how do you govern this thing? So you have this purpose of serving employees, the members of the company, the owners, are employees, and then how do you enact that? How do you govern that? Well, in this case, this company has a bicameral legislature, so it has 2 houses, a little bit like our Congress. It has a traditional board of directors, and then it also has a partnership council. Employees are called partners, and employees directly elect people onto this council. The ladies' lingerie department will elect a representative to the partnership council. The men's shirt department will elect somebody to the partnership council, and they decide things like pensions, and they decide things like contributions policy of the company. And then that body, I think, appoints about 1/3 of the board. So here's an example of a company. Purpose, membership, governance, all focused around employee happiness. This company's been around over 100 years. It's tends to outperform its peers financially. So there's an example of different kind of ownership living in the real world and existing today and being successful. So let me give you another example. As I said, industrial age ownership is a monoculture. The emerging kinds of ownership there's a lot of diversity, what I call biodiversity. Now, before I tell you another story, let me just say that I think that it's important to see that there are 2 schools of ownership design. There are really 2 paradigms. There's one, the dominant one that we live with now, we can call extractive. Its aim is extracting maximum amounts of wealth. Now, I want you to notice that word. I'm not saying creating wealth. That's, if you read the Wall Street Journal, they will tell you that they're creating wealth. The truth is that it's being extracted. It's being extracted from the environment, from the community, from wages. I mean, employee productivity has gone up dramatically in recent decades, and yet wages have been flat. That increased value has been extracted for a financial elite. The environment, as we know, is being depleted. That wealth is being extracted. And so extractive ownership design, I think, is kind of a useful concept. And so what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is what I call generative design. Generative, it's a lovely word. It comes from the same root as genes or genetics. It's about life. What's the DNA of life? What's the DNA of a different kind of economy that's organized to support life? And so employee ownership, that's one of the examples. Local ownership with Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. Another example is community ownership. You have, for example, community-owned wind. I visited Denmark. And as you fly into Copenhagen Harbor, you'll see standing there in the ocean waters just offshore, there's a series of wind turbines, tall industrial wind turbines, I don't know, a dozen or more. That is Lynetten Wind Farm. It's owned half by a municipal utility, which is a city-owned utility, and half by a wind guild. Now, a wind guild, we call them cooperatives in the U.S. or in England. In Denmark, they call them, they're called guilds. So it's community ownership. In Denmark, here's an interesting story. This is, today, Denmark produces about 20% of its energy from wind. That's more than any other nation. And the wind guilds are widely credited with creating this success. Not just by a lunatic fringe, but it's widely known that this is what happened. The wind guilds are ordinary people like you and me who had a few dollars to invest and got together and said, let's invest in wind. They had to change some of the laws. They had, there was, of course, a lot of work that had to go into it. But they got together. There's no middleman. They didn't go into a mutual fund. They said, let's get together, invest directly in wind, put up some wind farms. And they did. And they jump-started the wind industry in Denmark, which today is a world-leading success. So that's community ownership. We have employee ownership. We have community ownership. You'll notice in both cases, the ownership is rooted it's rooted in human hands. Somebody who lives in a community, somebody who works at a company. It's not rooted in a financial statement or in a number of a stock that's supposed to go up. You'll notice that extractive ownership is very abstract. It's not rooted anywhere. It's just supposed to be linear growth forever, and we know that's impossible. So it's rooted in an impossible ideal. Generative ownership is living ownership. Some real living person holds the ownership, and therefore that person is rooted in place, and so they're going to notice if that place is being trashed or if employees are not being paid enough. So rooting it in human hands gives some control to humans. Okay, so I'll give you another example, and this is I went to Maine. And I visited the lobster industry there, as much as one can visit an industry. But what I learned about Maine is considered the lobster industry is considered a leading example of what's called common pool resource management. That's kind of boring language, but it's about management of the commons. We've heard this story that if you don't have private ownership of the commons, you're going to have the tragedy of the commons. People are going to overgraze their cows on the commons, and so you have to have either state ownership or private ownership in order to protect the commons. Well, that turns out not to be true, and the person who determined that it's not true is Eleanor Ostrom, who unfortunately died a number of years ago. But she won a Nobel Prize for her work about commons management. And what she and her team of researchers determined is that there are examples all over the world of communities who are successfully managing the commons. And it could be a forest. In this case, it's a fishery. And so I went to Maine because I wanted to learn about this successful commons management. And what I learned is that in the Gulf of Maine, which is a very large body of water, most ground fish are depleted. And by that I mean cod and halibut and fisheries that used to, we have Cape Cod in Massachusetts. The waters used to be teeming with cod here, and cod are depleted. Most fisheries are depleted, but lobstering is thriving in the Gulf of Maine. There's something like a couple of hundred boats for ground fish in this Gulf, and there's more than 1,000 boats for lobster. And the reason is that there is essentially economic democracy is governing the lobster industry in Maine. You have zones, 7 or 8 lobster zones, where lobster fishermen elect their own representatives and help set rules like how many traps can you hang off a buoy and so forth. And the state has set rules based around the life of lobster. Like you can't take a female who has eggs on her. That's illegal. You can't take lobsters under a certain age or over a certain age. So there's all these rules, but but there's a really interesting ownership rule that's going on here, and that says that only owner-owned, let's see now, I'm not saying that right. Only, lobsterman, the fisherman has to own the boat that's fishing on the inshore waters. No corporate boats can fish inside the sensitive inshore waters where the lobster live. And so what that means is little guys, basically they have a rule that says only mom and pop operations can do lobster fishing, and they also have a rule that says you have to fish with traps and no trawling. Like these big ocean trawlers will have big nets and just scoop up the whole bottom. No, none of that. So you respect life, you respect the life of the lobsters, you respect the life of the bottom of the ocean, and you respect the life of the families that are are fishing there. And when you build those rules into economic democracy and into the ownership structure, lo and behold, what happens? You have a thriving lobster industry. You have a thriving families. You can actually make a living fishing for lobster. And so it's a tremendous example of how, so it's not just corporate ownership, it's any kind of ownership. Ownership is really an economic relationship. What is the relationship we have to the earth? What is the relationship we have to each other? What is the relationship we have to our economy? All of that is really about ownership. That's the most fundamental economic relationship there is who holds the assets, who controls the property. And so, so you can have community ownership, you can have employee ownership, you can have a cooperative ownership. There's municipal ownership, municipal wind, like in Denmark. So there's lots of different kinds of ownership that are generative. They're focused on life. Maybe it's helping people live in their homes. It's helping keep lobster alive and lobster families. It's making loans that are good loans, not extracting as much wealth from it as possible. So we can organize our economic life in generative ways, and that is foundational to creating a generative economy, which is, as we know, it's the only kind of economy that's going to be possible. So thanks.